No one inside the studio expected anything unusual that day. It wasn't a red carpet event. It wasn't a press call. There were no flashing cameras or crowds gathered behind barricades. It was the kind of quiet Hollywood afternoon where people moved on routine, not anticipation. Jason Statham arrived the way he often did, low-key, focused, dressed simply, blending in with the rhythm of the lot. To most people around him, he looked like any other professional showing up to work. Calm. Efficient. Unbothered. The hallways echoed with ordinary sounds. Footsteps. Distant voices. Equipment carts rolling past. Assistants checking schedules. Crew members laughing about something unrelated. Nothing hinted that this moment would matter. Jason walked through the space without slowing, his mind already shifting toward the work ahead. He'd been on sets his entire adult life. He understood the energy of places like this. He knew when something was about to happen. This didn't feel like one of those moments. And yet, halfway across the room, something changed. It wasn't a noise. It wasn't movement. It was a presence. Jason slowed without realizing why. His instincts did it before his thoughts caught up. Years of discipline, training, and awareness had taught him to recognize subtle shifts, those moments when the atmosphere itself felt heavier. Across the room, standing near a small group of producers, was a man who wasn't trying to be noticed. No dramatic posture. No commanding gestures. No need for attention. But the stillness around him was unmistakable. Chuck Norris stood there quietly, listening more than he spoke, his posture relaxed but grounded. The kind of calm that didn't come from confidence alone, but from certainty. Jason stopped walking. For a brief second, he questioned himself. Hollywood was full of legends, after all. He'd met them, worked alongside them, shared space with people whose names carried weight. This felt different. This wasn't admiration. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. Two paths from different generations, intersecting without warning. Chuck shifted his stance slightly, as if sensing the attention. His eyes lifted, not searching, not curious, just aware. Their gazes met. No smile. No nod. Just a moment of shared understanding that passed without words. The room carried on, unaware that anything significant had just occurred. But for Jason, something had already changed. Because some moments don't announce themselves. They simply arrive, quietly, and leave an impression that stays. The studio lot moved the way it always did, efficient, practiced, unremarkable. Crew members crossed paths without looking up, coffee cups in hand, walkie-talkies clipped to their belts. A production assistant jogged past, murmuring into a headset. Somewhere nearby, metal stands clinked together as lighting equipment was adjusted. The sound of routine filled the space, layered and constant. Jason Statham blended into it easily. That had always been his preference. Despite his reputation on screen, he never chased attention off it. He dressed simply, moved with purpose, and kept conversations short. There was work to do, and he respected the process too much to disrupt it. He checked the schedule briefly, nodded to a coordinator he recognized, and continued walking. Nothing about the day felt unusual. It wasn't a first day. It wasn't a final shoot. Just another moment in a long career built on consistency. Around him, the lot reflected that same sense of normalcy. A group of actors rehearsed lines quietly near a wall. A director reviewed notes with a cinematographer. Laughter drifted from a corner where crew members shared a story that had nothing to do with the project at hand. No one was performing for cameras. No one was posturing. This was the version of Hollywood most people never saw. Jason appreciated that. He'd learned early on that the real work happened far away from premieres and headlines. Discipline, repetition, patience, those were the things that lasted. That mindset had carried him through years of demanding roles, physical preparation, and long shoots. As he reached the waiting area, he paused, setting his bag down and scanning the room with a quick, instinctive glance. Not out of caution, out of habit. That's when he noticed him again. Chuck Norris stood a short distance away, now separated from the producers he'd been speaking with. He wasn't centered in the room. He wasn't elevated. He simply occupied his space with ease. Chuck didn't look like someone trying to assert relevance. There was no urgency in his posture, no effort to command attention. His hands rested comfortably at his sides, his stance balanced, his gaze steady. Jason found himself observing the details. The lack of tension. The absence of performance. The way people around Chuck adjusted subtly, lowered voices, calmer movements, without realizing why. It reminded Jason of training environments he'd known years ago. Gyms where the most dangerous person in the room never needed to announce it. Places where respect wasn't requested, it was assumed. Chuck shifted slightly, listening as someone nearby spoke. He nodded once, thoughtfully, before offering a brief reply. No speeches. No advice given unless it was asked for. Jason recognized that restraint immediately. He thought about how different eras of action cinema often blurred strength with noise. Bigger explosions. Louder dialogue. More spectacle. But the men who truly endured, the ones whose names carried weight decades later, were rarely the loudest. They were the calmest. Jason leaned back against the wall, folding his arms loosely, giving himself a moment. He wasn't waiting for an opening. He wasn't planning an introduction. He was simply aware of where he was standing, and who else shared the space. Around them, the lot continued its rhythm. Someone called out a time adjustment. A clipboard snapped shut. Footsteps echoed down the corridor and faded again. The day moved forward without interruption. But internally, Jason felt a quiet recalibration. He thought about longevity. About how careers were sustained not by intensity alone, but by control. By knowing when to push and when to hold back. By understanding that real authority didn't require constant demonstration. Chuck looked up again, briefly, his eyes passing over the room. They landed on Jason for a fraction of a second longer than before. Not a stare. Just acknowledgement. Jason nodded once, subtly. That was it. No handshake. No exchange of words. No attempt to turn the moment into something more than it was. And somehow, that made it meaningful. Jason realized that this was the kind of moment people talked about later, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. Two professionals, separated by generation but united by principle, sharing a space without ego. It reminded him why he'd stayed in this industry as long as he had. Not for the noise. Not for the attention. But for moments of quiet clarity like this, where respect moved silently through a room, and no one needed to explain it. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt that someone there carried a different kind of weight? Recognition didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers. At first, it was instinctive, the kind that lived below conscious thought. Jason Statham felt it before he could name it, the subtle tightening of focus that came from years of training his awareness. He wasn't on alert. He wasn't tense. He was simply present in a different way. He watched as Chuck Norris listened to someone speaking nearby. Chuck didn't interrupt. He didn't rush the exchange. He allowed the other person to finish fully before responding, and when he did, his words were brief, measured. That restraint stood out. Hollywood was full of people who filled space with sound. Opinions delivered loudly. Stories stretched longer than necessary. Advice given whether it was asked for or not. Jason had navigated that environment long enough to spot the difference immediately. Chuck didn't compete for attention. He didn't need to. Jason shifted his stance slightly, uncrossing his arms, grounding himself without realizing it. There was something familiar in the way Chuck carried himself, something Jason had encountered not in film sets, but in training rooms, in quiet moments before a fight, in places where respect mattered more than reputation. This wasn't celebrity recognition. It was professional recognition. Jason thought back to his early years, when he was still proving himself. Back then, he'd believed strength was about endurance, about pushing harder than anyone else, lasting longer, refusing to break. Over time, experience had refined that belief. Real strength, he'd learned, was knowing when not to push. Chuck embodied that lesson without saying a word. Their eyes met again, this time holding just a fraction longer. Not challenging. Not curious. Simply aware. Jason felt no pressure to approach. No urgency to speak. The absence of that impulse surprised him. In another context, another room, He might have felt the unspoken expectation to acknowledge a legend, to initiate an exchange. Here, it felt unnecessary. The recognition had already happened. Around them, the room remained oblivious. Conversations continued. Schedules were checked. Someone laughed nearby, the sound echoing briefly before dissolving back into the background noise of the lot. Jason wondered how many people in the space understood what they were standing near. Not fame. Experience. Chuck's posture shifted subtly, his weight redistributing with ease. Jason noticed it because he recognized it, the balance of someone always prepared, not for conflict, but for awareness. There was no stiffness, no guarded tension. Just readiness. It reminded Jason of moments before complex stunt work, when everything slowed internally even as chaos surrounded him. The body aligned. The mind sharpened. Noise faded. This felt similar. Jason inhaled slowly, letting the recognition settle. He wasn't comparing himself. He wasn't measuring worth. He was acknowledging lineage, an unspoken connection between people who understood discipline at a fundamental level. Chuck turned slightly, ending his interaction and stepping a pace away. As he did, his gaze swept the room naturally, not searching for validation, but staying aware of his environment. It landed on Jason again. This time, Chuck offered a small nod. Barely noticeable. Jason returned it. That was all. No one else reacted. No one noticed. And that, somehow, made it more meaningful. Jason felt a quiet shift inside himself, not dramatic, not emotional. Just a recalibration of perspective. He thought about how easily moments like this were missed. How often people mistook noise for importance, visibility for influence. Chuck began walking toward another part of the lot, unhurried. People made space without realizing they were doing it. Conversations paused and resumed. The flow adjusted subtly around him, like water around a stone. Jason watched him go, not with awe, but with understanding. This was what longevity looked like. Not dominance. Not spectacle. But consistency. Control. Presence. Jason straightened, picking up his bag again. The workday continued. Schedules still mattered. Scenes still needed to be shot. But something internal had shifted. Because recognition like this didn't ask for acknowledgement. It simply reminded you of who you were, and who you were trying to remain. The decision to approach wasn't sudden. It formed quietly, shaped by timing rather than impulse. Jason Statham didn't feel urgency or pressure. He felt clarity. The kind that came when instinct and judgment aligned. He adjusted the strap of his bag and stepped forward, his pace unhurried. There was no dramatic shift in the room, no visible change in energy. To anyone watching, it would have looked like an ordinary interaction about to begin. But Jason understood moments like this. They didn't announce themselves. As he closed the distance, Chuck Norris turned naturally, as if he'd sensed the approach before hearing footsteps. His attention moved fully now, his posture open, his expression neutral. There was no need for introductions. Jason extended his hand. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone even, respectful. Chuck took the handshake firmly, without force. His grip was solid but relaxed, the kind that conveyed presence without challenge. "Neither did I," Chuck replied. The exchange was brief, but something settled between them instantly. Mutual understanding without excess. No embellishment. No need to elevate the moment beyond what it was. They stood side by side rather than face to face, an unconscious choice that signaled alignment rather than confrontation. The nearby noise of the lot continued, voices, movement, schedules unfolding, but the space between them felt contained. Jason spoke again, not to impress, not to steer the conversation, but to acknowledge what mattered. "I grew up watching your work," he said simply. "It meant something." Chuck inclined his head slightly. "I appreciate that." There was no false humility in the response. Just acceptance. They spoke about work, but not projects or box office numbers. They talked about discipline, about consistency, about how training changed over time, shifting from intensity to efficiency. Chuck listened carefully, never interrupting. When he spoke, his words were measured, chosen carefully rather than offered freely. You learn eventually, Chuck said, that control lasts longer than power. Jason absorbed that. He'd learned similar lessons in his own way, through injury, through repetition, through years of pushing physical limits and learning where restraint mattered more. The conversation wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Around them, a few people began to notice, not because of who was speaking, but because of how. The lack of volume. The absence of performance. The calm orbit forming quietly around the exchange. Someone nearby lowered their voice without realizing it. Another person paused before walking past, instinctively giving space. Jason felt the tension not as discomfort, but as gravity. He thought about how rare it was to speak with someone who didn't need to fill silence. Someone who understood that pauses carried meaning. Chuck glanced briefly at his watch, a subtle signal. Responsibilities waited. Schedules moved forward. Jason nodded. "I won't keep you," he said. Chuck smiled faintly. "Good to meet you." They shook hands once more, no ceremony, no prolonging. As Chuck turned to leave, Jason felt a strange sensation, not loss, but completion. The kind that came from an exchange that had given exactly what it needed to, no more, no less. Chuck walked away with the same quiet presence he'd carried when he arrived. People adjusted unconsciously. Space opened and closed around him. Jason remained where he was for a moment, letting the encounter settle. He didn't replay the words. He didn't dissect the interaction. He understood it. The rising tension he'd felt earlier, the sense that something significant was approaching, had resolved not through spectacle, but through simplicity. This wasn't a meeting meant for cameras. It was a moment meant to recalibrate perspective. Jason exhaled slowly, feeling grounded. The workday resumed. Scenes still waited. Responsibilities still demanded attention. But the tone had shifted. Not outwardly. Internally. Because some encounters don't change your direction. They remind you why you chose it in the first place. The conversation didn't end when the handshake did. It lingered. Jason Statham walked a few steps away, then slowed. Not because he was uncertain, but because something Chuck had said stayed with him, settling deeper the longer he carried it. You learn eventually that control lasts longer than power. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't delivered like advice meant to impress. They were offered plainly, like a truth that didn't need persuasion. Jason had heard countless versions of that idea over the years, usually wrapped in bravado or motivational language. This felt different. It felt earned. He stopped near a row of chairs, resting his hand on the back of one, watching the lot continue its rhythm. People passed him without noticing anything unusual. To them, it was just another day, another set, another schedule to follow. But Jason felt a shift. Not emotional. Not nostalgic. Clarifying. Across the way, Chuck Norris had rejoined a small group, listening again more than speaking. Jason observed how Chuck interacted, not dominating the conversation, not steering it forcefully. He allowed others to speak fully, then responded only when it mattered. There was no waste in his movements. No excess. Jason recognized that economy immediately. In action films, every movement was designed to look decisive, powerful, final. But behind the scenes, the real mastery came from efficiency, knowing how to conserve energy, how to remain precise even when fatigue set in. This was that same principle, applied to presence. Jason thought about his own career, about the roles that had defined him, not because they were loud, but because they were controlled. Characters who didn't overreact. Men who acted decisively but without chaos. He realized something quietly unsettling. The audience often mistook restraint for simplicity. But restraint was harder. Anyone could react. Anyone could escalate. Very few could remain measured when escalation was an option. Chuck glanced up briefly, sensing Jason's attention again. Their eyes met once more. This time, there was something different in the look. Not recognition, not assessment. Understanding. Jason gave a small nod. Chuck returned it. Nothing more was needed. The exchange had already done its work. Jason resumed walking, heading toward where he was needed next. His pace felt steadier now, as if something had aligned internally. Not because he'd gained something new, but because something old had been reinforced. Discipline. Longevity. Control. He passed a mirror mounted along the corridor and caught his own reflection briefly. Same posture. Same calm exterior. But the reminder mattered. It's easy, after years of success, to mistake momentum for direction. To confuse movement with progress. Encounters like this cut through that noise. Chuck didn't offer advice. He offered an example. And that was more powerful. Jason stepped into the next space, ready to work, carrying the moment with him not as a story, but as a standard. If you believe respect matters more than reputation, type respect in the comments. The rest of the day unfolded without interruption. That was the strange part. There was no ripple through the studio, no sudden buzz, no whispered retelling that grew larger with each version. Schedules stayed intact. Calls were made. Scenes were blocked. Work continued the way it always did. On the surface, nothing had changed. Jason Statham moved through the afternoon with the same discipline he always brought to set. He listened to direction. He adjusted where needed. He ran through sequences with focus and efficiency. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed a slightly quieter intensity, but only if they knew what to look for. Most didn't. Between setups, Jason found himself paying attention to smaller things. The rhythm of his breathing. The way he conserved movement between takes. The value of stillness when nothing needed to be said. It wasn't new knowledge. It was reinforced knowledge. That distinction mattered. Across the lot, Chuck Norris finished his own responsibilities without ceremony. No lingering conversations. No extended goodbyes. He left the same way he had arrived, quietly, leaving behind no visible trace of his presence. And yet, something subtle remained. A few crew members who had witnessed the exchange, though they might not have fully understood it, carried a different energy afterward. Conversations softened slightly. Movements slowed. The environment felt marginally more deliberate, as if calm had briefly set the tone. No one commented on it. Jason noticed. He thought about how influence really worked. Not through authority or volume, but through example. The kind that didn't announce itself, didn't demand recognition, didn't linger for validation. It simply existed. As the day drew on, Jason caught himself resisting old habits. Moments where he might normally push harder, assert more, speak sooner, he paused instead. Not out of hesitation, but out of choice. Control, he realized again, wasn't passive. It was active restraint. There was a difference. Late in the afternoon, during a brief break, Jason stepped aside near an open doorway and looked out across the lot. The light had shifted. Shadows stretched longer now. The noise softened as the day eased toward evening. He thought about longevity, not just in career, but in identity. How many people started strong and burned out? How many mistook force for effectiveness, speed for progress? How many confused being seen with being respected? He'd watched it happen to others. Sometimes quickly. Sometimes slowly. The encounter earlier hadn't given him answers. It had sharpened the questions. What kind of presence did he want to carry? Not today, but years from now. When the noise faded. When the spotlight moved on. When performance was no longer enough. The answer didn't arrive as words. It arrived as alignment. Jason returned to work for the final stretch of the day, focused, efficient, unhurried. The scenes wrapped without issue. Notes were exchanged. Equipment was packed down. The day ended the way it had begun, ordinarily. But internally, the impact remained. He understood now that some moments weren't meant to be shared or retold. They weren't designed for stories or interviews. They existed to recalibrate something private. To remind you of the standard you chose. As he left the lot, the air cooler now, Jason didn't look back. There was no reason to. The value of the moment wasn't tied to the place. It was tied to what he carried forward. And that was enough. Because the most meaningful encounters don't announce themselves with drama. They leave quietly. And change how you move from that point on. The moment didn't follow Jason home. It didn't replay itself on a loop. It didn't turn into a story he felt the urge to tell. That was how he knew it mattered. Jason Statham woke the next morning and moved through his routine the way he always had. Training. Focus. Preparation. Nothing felt dramatically different on the surface. But something subtle had settled in. A steadiness. On set later that day, people noticed it without knowing why. Jason spoke less, but when he did, his words landed with more clarity. He didn't rush decisions. He didn't over-explain direction. He listened more carefully, weighed responses before offering them. The work benefited from it. So did the people around him. There was no mention of the encounter. No, you won't believe who I met. No attempt to frame it as a moment of status or validation. Jason understood instinctively that doing so would dilute what it had been. Some exchanges weren't meant to be shared. They were meant to be absorbed. He thought again of Chuck Norris, not as a legend, not as an icon, but as a reference point. A reminder of what longevity actually looked like when stripped of hype and noise. It wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about fear. It wasn't even about reputation. It was about consistency. About being the same person in quiet rooms as you were in loud ones. About carrying authority without needing to display it. About understanding that real respect arrived slowly and stayed. Jason realized that many people chased moments that looked impressive from the outside. Viral encounters. Big reactions. Public validation. But those moments often burned fast and faded just as quickly. This one hadn't. Because it didn't ask to be seen. Days passed. The project moved forward. New scenes replaced old ones. New challenges demanded attention. Life continued the way it always did. Forward, indifferent to meaning unless you chose to assign it. But Jason noticed something in himself. He was calmer under pressure. More selective with energy. Less interested in proving anything. Not because he'd lost ambition, but because his ambition had matured. He understood now that the most powerful people rarely announce themselves. They don't enter rooms to be felt. They enter rooms already complete. That was the lesson. Not delivered. Not explained. Simply demonstrated. Years from now, when people might ask Jason about defining moments in his career, this one probably wouldn't come up. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't fit neatly into a headline. But it would still be there. Quietly shaping how he moved. How he spoke. How he chose restraint over reaction. Because the strongest moments don't always arrive with applause. Sometimes they arrive in silence. And leave you better than they found you.